Hi, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. I've just started the meeting a few minutes early because we could see that people were joining, so we wanted to assure you that the webinar is going ahead. We will start the formal proceedings at 12 o'clock as advertised, but we just wanted to open it up and make sure that everybody can join us. Feel free to say hello to fellow attendees in the chat. I'm Helen Kelly, I'm from Nautilus International, and I'm being joined today by Alina Prylipko from MLA College. And like I said, we will start our formal presentations in a couple of minutes, but feel free to say hello in the meantime. A little bit of housekeeping. We will keep the videos and the sound off for all attendees. So if you do want to communicate, the chat group is the best way to do that. Feel free to ask any questions of myself or Alina as we're going through. You can do it via the Q&A function. You can also do it via the chat if that's your preferred option. I will keep an eye on both of those feeds. Hi, Anne Catherine, nice to see you. Thanks for saying hello. Also, to let everybody know, we will be recording this session today, and there will be a transcript made of the session. We will be posting those on our YouTube channel after the webinar, so please do feel free to like that and to share that with any colleagues who are not able to attend live today. Hi, Dimitro. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Glenn, hello. Nice to see you too, Glenn Cairns. We'll give it one more minute to allow some others to join us, and then we will start more formally. Okay, well, I make that 12 o'clock. Let's start our session. Good day to everybody and a very warm welcome to this Nautilus International webinar on building a stronger voice for seafarers in a just transition. I'm Helen Kelly from Nautilus International, and I am delighted to host this important discussion today in partnership with MLA College. Before we begin, I'll go items again, just to confirm that the cameras and microphones will stay off throughout the webinar. If you have any questions for our speakers, please do use the Q&A function. You can use the chat as well. I will keep an eye on both of those feeds, but please do put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll try and get as many of those to Alina as possible. The webinar lasts about 30 minutes. Can extend slightly if there's lots of questions coming in. Both Alina and I have blocked out our schedule because I know that we always get really good interaction at these webinars. So we are happy to stay on for some extra minutes if lots in. And again, just to reiterate that the webinar will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. So please welcome to share this with your friends and your colleagues, and let everybody know that they can see that on our YouTube channel. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our expert speaker. Alina Prylipko is a senior lecturer at MLA College. Alina's going to concept of a just transition and what this means for seafarers in practical terms. It is a bit of jargon, people can struggle with it, so don't worry. Alina will walk you through that and give you a really good understanding of what we mean by a just transition. She's also going to help us understand how we can ensure that seafarers' skills and training, their needs are properly addressed during this period that we're going through, which is quite a lot of significant industry change. And she's also going to discuss how you take part in the conversation, whether that be at a national or an international level. So Alina, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues, whenever you are. Thank you so much for your patience and waiting for me to rejoin very inconveniently. Yeah, but we are here now, and I guess that following on from what Helen said, I'm quite glad and grateful that there are quite a few things that we can still achieve with all the technical problems and difficulties that we have. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful for Nautical Institute, for Nautilus International, for all the professional associations that has been in recent times giving me opportunity to speak to their members and to seafarers. I'm really grateful because actually seafarers are at the heart of the work that I do and my research. So talking and having some feedback from you as well is really, really instrumental for my research. But I also think that it's quite important that our research is practical, and that's what we are trying to achieve with this meeting today. So I think first it would be helpful if I briefly outline what we are going to talk today about. I think there is a lot going on currently about the just transition, and the word is used very frequently. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to fully understand what is being referred to. So I think it would be good if we spend just a couple of minutes at first trying to understand what are we going to talk here about and what is just transition and what is the purpose of this. The other aspect I wanted to discuss with you today is actually the voice of seafarers. In the work that I'm doing, I'm taking quite an alternative perspective instead of asking seafarers directly, which is, I think, valid approach, and I'm seeking more input from seafarers. But in my research, I decided to ask other stakeholders, how do they see seafarers' perspective? Because we do appreciate probably with you that the voice of anybody in a stakeholder landscape is relative. So it was interesting for me to compare a little bit what other stakeholders think about seafarers and what maybe most powerful stakeholders or most effective stakeholders do that we could learn from. And in the last part of my presentation today, I would like just to discuss a little bit more in details how we can build a stronger voice for seafarers. So without further ado, just transition, what does that really mean? I think the first thing I wish to say and share with the audience today is that we shouldn't forget that just transition is not only about decarbonization. Originally, the term started within the environmental movement in 70s in the US, but we can include quite a broad range of considerations, including climate transition, energy transition, and some other things. So the term is not only limited to the current trends and hot topics. And I think this is important because there's quite a wide range of issues that I think seafarer community is experiencing, ranging from, fatigue, lack of social security, pensions, protections, and things like that. So the term just transition is really stressing the importance of considering broader implications on people and not necessarily focusing only on decarbonizations. However, that's where the term started with the environmental movement. Any transition has its benefits. We understand that we want to develop, we want to improve, and we want to grow, but it also comes with costs and risks. And the concept of just transition, or the idea behind it, is just to account for those costs and risks and be mindful, more particularly, who wins, but also who loses or who can potentially have some negative consequences or suffer from some negative consequences, why that happens and how we can address that problem. And I know that our meeting today, our webinar today is dedicated to seafarers, but before we proceed and dive in deep, into topic of seafarers, I also want to stress that the concept of just transition is about all employees, shore side, if we are talking about the maritime industry, or seafarers, but also a broader set of sectors that are interlinked. It's also about communities, port communities, seafarers' families. We can also look at countries, and there are some countries that are more dependent on sea traffic and sea trade than others, and even societies in general. So even though as we proceed, we will be talking more specifically about seafarers, I think we should remember that there are the vulnerable groups or categories of groups that need to be taken into consideration if we are talking about decarbonization or automation or any of the transitions that are happening at the present moment. So just transition, as you can see from the slide, is actually justice in transition. So we want to be equitable, we want to have that level of justice, and we want to, more importantly, be inclusive for the most vulnerable people so that nobody's left behind. And the reason for that is that research and practice demonstrates that it's actually those who are more disadvantaged and more vulnerable tend to get more affected by this transition and disadvantaged by that transition. So we try just to be mindful of the implications it might have on other people. And if we want to find a simple definition, away from maybe complicated academic or legal definitions, it's just simply accounting for all those implications that will have on people. So that's what just transition typically refers to. However, I cannot necessarily put aside my academic hat and just talk about day-to-day aspects and practical implications. I also want to talk that just transition has quite an important philosophical, socio-economical, or even political economy implications. So there's only few things that we can do, and we will be discussing them later today, on the day-to-day basis without fundamental structural changes in how we give voice to other people, and not only give voice, but support them with resources necessary to be equitably represented. So there are some very important, we can call them probably paradigmatic or fundamental principles that also need to be accounted with. And it is very strongly underpinned by different power dynamics. And I know that this is not the purpose of our meeting, but I just wanted to make that disclaimer that there is so much we can do before I think the short-term quick fixes will exhaust themselves, and we would need to consider a more fundamental or systematic change. So now, more specifically about the voice of seafarers, I did mention to you that I have taken an alternative approach to my PhD, to my doctoral studies and my research. And what I decided to do is I was very curious to hear what other influential stakeholders think and do when they try to advocate for social matters. How do they manage to put the message across, to get their perspective accounted in policy and decision making? What can we learn from them? And how do they perceive seafarers could have stronger voice? So I have conducted 43 semi-structured interviews. They are with senior management representatives mainly. And I was quite puzzled who to interview, because we know that when we talk about a shipping company, there's a number of sectors, number of stakeholders, and it's quite difficult to select one that would be representative. So I come up with this alternative idea that instead of asking one, let's say, ship owner or stakeholder, I'll ask organization or association that represents stakeholders, and perhaps they could shed a light among differences among their members and how all the stakeholders approach the topic. So I went and interviewed 43 organizations. They were international, they were regional, they were non-governmental, and they ranged from communities, those that represent communities, to charities, professional associations, even people working in financial sector, charterers, shipbrokers, those that supply equipment on board. So it was quite a broad range, but they were associations. So I hope that gives a little bit of credibility to the voice that it was coming from the participants. So the first thing that I want to mention is that when we will be talking today about some of the findings that might be a little bit shocking and might be eye-opening, I want to first stress that the industry is diverse, and we do not have the good, the bad, and the ugly. We do have within every sector stakeholders which are very responsible socially and that do a great job, and they're pioneering the work in their field. We can call them maybe sector leaders or first movers. And we have a middle side, those that are maybe trying to catch up, and maybe those, the third group is those that are struggling to meet, the current demands, so to speak. So it is quite difficult to say, the regulator or the customers or the charterers. And I think we should be stepping away from those broad statements when we talk about stakeholders, because there are diversities within the business itself. What my participants believe is that when it comes to seafarers matters, seafarers voice, there is a raising awareness, there is a lot of talk, but they feel there is a lack of concrete actions. One might argue that the recent, changes that happened within the International Labour Organization and changes, they are moving us closer and closer to better working and living conditions for seafarers and better protection. But this is still not necessarily, what we would like to see. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that, once again, we go back to those fundamental changes, fundamental differences, how shipping business and shipping industry as a sector operates. Yeah. One of the comments that came quite strongly, and I was considering should I share this in this presentation or not, but there is a lot of dissatisfaction from the stakeholders coming to the flag states and countries of nationalities of ship owners, and they feel that they might have done a little bit more. I do appreciate that might be coming still with the COVID-19 pandemic consequences of all the disruptions that were caused there. But there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and stakeholders believe that we could have done more if those groups taken more ownership and advocated for seafarers more actively. Apart from that, moving more specifically about what do they think about seafarers, I ask them, do they have voice? What kind of role they play in current transition? What can we learn? Some of the comments that I received were quite disheartening, if I'm honest. Quite a large part of respondents felt that seafarers were disposable. Their lives maybe didn't matter, or they were looked at resource as a cost or as a commodity. One of my participants took a moment to think and then looked at me and said, "It's tragic, isn't it?" And I was surprised to see that industry and business all understand that we are not yet doing everything we could do for seafarers. They did mention that seafarers' voice seems to be fragmented. Cultural differences, nationality, different types of vessels, different professional organizations and associations, and they felt that there could be done more to bring that voice as a one clear message. They also stressed that probably the underpinning factor that contributes to the problems that we are observing currently is that they are weaker player in contractual relationships. They are not always in a position to negotiate. Some are maybe lucky that they do have that ability, to negotiate their contract, their working and living conditions, their wage, but not every seafarer is in that position. So unfortunately, that lack of social security and job security is one of the underpinning factors that seems to contribute to the fact that seafarers feel they don't have enough of voice. So what can we do? What can be done for seafarers to have stronger voice? And it is a complex question, and I would probably have to say that I do not have all the answers. So maybe during the discussion, we'll have more ideas. But it's possible theoretically, yeah, but it might be much more difficult in practice to do. And the first strategy that is being proposed is to partner, to use partner stakeholders that have strong voice already and that are willing to advocate for seafarers. So here we are talking about unions, about other non-governmental organizations that not only advocate for environmental concerns, but also have that social direction that they work. Also looking at how your countries of nationality can be influenced. Professional associations do a lot of great work and represent voice of seafarers, as well as welfare and charity organizations. And my research also says that the true power and the true change doesn't come from one particular stakeholder. It seems to come more from networks and alliances. So if seafarers and unions can work together with academia or NGO, can work together with professional associations and maybe more ship owners, charters, and create those alliances. That's where the power, true power, could be generated. But obviously that leaves very little for seafarers. What can we do? One of the things is that it seems to be that we still need to have a business case for looking after seafarers. So those first movers or those industry leaders who are doing a lot, their principle is who cares wins. So those organizations that care for seafarers, they hope that that will bring them competitive advantage. So we like it or we don't, but it seems to be the narrative that the industry is accepting. Yeah. Some of the most effective NGOs, they seem to put a lot of effort on the art of communicating that urgency and that importance, making the message of seafarer for those broader industry to be appealing. And even though we would wish that maybe we don't need to go to the art of communication, but it is quite important that we have a very articulate message that we want to put across, and we want to make that kind of business case. And as I mentioned before, there's some also more structural changes that might be required. We want to see governments in a stronger position. We want to have tripartite model that ILO is using implemented more broadly. We want to have more participatory justice. And those are maybe topics for a separate webinar or even maybe, a seminar or philosophical discourse. But in terms of seafarers, one of the comments that my participants said that they believe that solidarity on board and work together on board has a lot of potential. So when you have that cohesion on board, when the crew member together with the safety officer and the senior management team on board, if everybody supports, the safety concern related to that particular alternative fuel, that's where things could also start potentially changing. Participants believed also that awareness raising and capacity building, sort of bringing the message to seafarers like we do now, and empowering seafarers to advocate for themselves. One of the comments that was also mentioned is that seafarers do have power, but participants felt that maybe they do not understand or don't fully appreciate how strong they are. Yeah, we don't have seafarers protesting. We don't have seafarers taking, industry actions. But we have seen during COVID how impactful the role that seafarers do could be. With the reservation of, the challenges associated with the contractual arrangements. But if you have a job security and if you have a stable contractual arrangements, the participants felt that it's not we should try to encourage seafarers to not accept poor practices, to ask, to negotiate, to build the communication with relevant bodies, and if necessary, maybe to even demand, the conditions that are required. And another practical solution is to share experience. To participate in surveys, there's so many of them currently, but when academia or unions, when we can go back to the industry and say, well, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 10,000 old seafarers believe this is the problem, we can make a case and we can articulate that message much better. It's also about joining, organizations like that that represent seafarers and maybe even having an active position, active standpoint in that organization would also help to advocate for changes. But that is just a surface that we managed to scratch in 15 minutes or so that I was allowed. But I think that I hope we can discuss a little bit more now with you together. What could be done? So I would be very glad to hear any questions that you have, and perhaps we can discuss it in more details.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Alina. Some really challenging feedback from the stakeholders that you received as part of your research for your dissertation there. I mean, I was personally quite shocked by it, perhaps in a way not surprised because I have heard similar feedback from stakeholders myself, but I do want to reassure everybody, because I know we have members and non-members on this webinar today, taking part in those democratic structures that a trade union can provide certainly is one very strong way to ensure that you have that support in terms of your contractual arrangements to make sure that you're getting, the pay and conditions that you should be getting when you're at sea or ashore, but also those democratic to with the International Transport Workers Federation, the European Transport Workers Federation, and our own Nautilus Federation, that really enables us to feed into those international discussions, and very important ones around regulations that affect seafarers, such as the Maritime Labour Convention. As I'm sure many people know, we've had some recent updates to that, which Nautilus was very proudly a part of. And I'm just going to put a little link in the chat there if anybody on this webinar would like to update themselves with, your latest protections under MLC. We've got some information there on the website. But just to reassure everybody, due to our technical difficulties at the start of the webinar, we will be running through until 12:45. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A or into the chat. I am checking both, and feel free to put them there. You can to myself or to Alina. And while people are thinking of those questions, I do have one that, Alina, I can start with here. So you talked about stakeholders there quite a lot, and in terms of some of that challenging feedback that I mentioned, but which stakeholders in the industry do you think currently have the strongest voice on this matter of a just transition? And perhaps how does that compare to seafarers if it's not seafarers with the strongest voice?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think it is really important to think and consider who are those organizations that are already in a strong position, who are already able to use that power, and should we be able to communicate and work together with them, we can use that channel. So there are quite a few different criteria how we look at that, but one of the most quick and one of the most successful in the way that they work are actually obviously believed to be unions. So unions are very responsive to every current need. And that also comes with some businesses, but maybe not to the same extent, obviously, as unions. And not far from that is non-governmental organizations and associations. So those are the ones that, if we need to have a quick action, those are the ones that most likely react the fastest. Seafarers and employees in general, everybody believes their claims. They say, well, that's a legitimate concern. We want to, address that problem, but that doesn't seem to be enough. We do have quite a lot of other legitimate stakeholders, like the needs of society, or what families need, what would be the best for the family, or what would be the best for the charterer, as an example. But when it comes to real power, the most powerful are believed to be customers of ship owners. So cargo interests, shippers, charterers, they are the ones that are requesting the transportation service. So if they have enough of demand, which they don't, unfortunately, currently, they don't have that demand. But if they would demand the industry to be more socially responsible, that's where we would see potentially change. It was also obviously felt that regulators are quite strong, because they have that, they can produce the legislation and just simply mandate what we have to comply with. But if you look at various categories across, that ability to influence, on average, one of the most influential is still regulators. So it's the intergovernmental organizations like IMO and ILO, flag states, port states. On average, they're believed to be the most powerful. And after that, it's non-governmental organizations and other sort of businesses like ship owners, any other enterprises. Unfortunately, when we look specifically at seafarers, everybody says that their claims are, morally valid, but they comment on the lack of power. So that they have. So the most effective strategy for seafarers still to be remains to use other stakeholders in partnership and in cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would just reiterate being part of a maritime trade union does give seafarers that ability to raise in partnership. And to your point of regulation, Alina, absolutely a lot of power in the but as we know, both with the International Maritime Organization and ILO, they can pass the regulations, but it's up to the member states to have passed them into national law before they can come into effect. So there are additional steps on top of the passing of the regulation and it coming into force at a national level. So that can also create a bit of a delay and a lack of some protections for seafarers. Glenn and Dimitro have come in with some questions. I'll start with you, Glenn, if you don't mind. Alina, are you positive for the future? Do you see the necessary commitments from governments, especially in the areas of fuel/green challenges?
Yeah, I personally feel that the most promising driver for change will be the younger generations. It seems the commitment, the drive, their unwillingness to compromise some of the work-life balance challenges, I think that's where the trend will come. And we are currently talking quite a lot about, lack of suitably qualified seafarers, that we struggle to attract and retain. And I think that seems to be the most powerful message that the younger generations can make to the industry, that if the industry is not attractive, there won't be the workforce, there won't be interest. So I think that yes, and this will change as well, but I think that the change will most likely come with the younger generations.
Yeah, sure. I think also in terms of skills and training, there is an element of retraining that is going to be needed, isn't there, for people who are already working at sea, who may be used to, your more traditional fuels, as an example, and they are making that transition over to newer fuels or battery operated vessels, and there needs to be an element of retraining. Who pays for that training? At the moment, many companies push that onto the seafarers, whereas we as seafarer representatives would say actually the company should be paying for it, or maybe there should be a scheme at governmental levels to help subsidize that training. So that should also come into consideration, Alina.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that the question of training is one of the most widely discussed currently in the industry, but the industry has a vested interest in that because they want to have qualified seafarers and they want to comply with their requirements on having, competent crews, which is part of the industry's responsibility. But I think what we indeed need to see that in just transition, what we are trying to achieve, we're just trying to achieve that there is no cost associated, or not necessarily direct financial cost, but the broader consideration of the cost that is associated with seafarers. And those who don't have job security, they have short-term contracts, or those who are maybe don't have companies that are able to support, sponsor a fund, just because that's not part of their bigger strategy, they will be disadvantaged. So I think that one of the solutions could be is that if industry does look together to maybe have some publicly funded training, I think that would be exceptionally powerful tool to make sure that is accessible to everybody, with no cost.
Yeah, agreed. Now, Dimitri, I'm going to put your question forward. Please do let me know in the chat if I don't get this correct. But I think, Dimitri, what you're saying is this, from your experience, the seafarer's voice is stronger the longer that they have been employed by the company or, employed on board that ship. Alina, would you agree with that? Does that kind of give seafarers voice, or can somebody quite new into the industry, quite new into a company, also find an avenue, input into this conversation?
I think we all have different perspectives because partly it is based on the personal experiences that we had with particular company. But I think that what is quite fundamental, it seems, is that if seafarer has a job security or not, and not necessarily with the company, but just in general, their employment position, their background, their cultural situation. One of my participants, for instance, they asked me, why do we see a decline in seafarers coming from countries where there's high standards of human rights and labor rights? Those countries do not supply that much of seafarers, but the countries that on the rise, where those standards are lower. And I think this is a very powerful question for us to consider. In terms of employment with the company, I think that if you have a job security, you feel more empowered, absolutely. And if you have trust, you have developed trust with your company, you know their organizational culture, you know that you can put the message across, be it through shipboard, management meeting or safety meetings as they used to be called, be it through your appraisals or your work with DPA or your work, you can get the message across, but obviously it is quite limited to the organizational culture that we are talking, and not all companies will have and give seafarers the same voice, and that's partly the problem we are facing currently.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always good to have strength in numbers when you are tackling a new conversation or perhaps a slightly tricky conversation. So I've just jumped over to the Q&A function now, and I can see that, Ross, you've put a question in there. Alina, how do you think you can get the message of a just transition to seafarers? As Ross says, it's great that it's such a hot topic, but if you ask your average seafarer, of course, what does just transition mean? They probably wouldn't know. How would you respond to that?
Absolutely. I think that unfortunately our academic concepts, in some of our day-to-day business and shoreside terminology is not the most transferable to the seafarers, and it's hard to really understand what it is. That's why I think raising awareness and what I call capacity building or empowering seafarers through a more pragmatic and more easy to implement and follow instructions is quite instrumental. I think in this regard, the advice that seafarers get, for instance, from unions or from other non-governmental organizations that work with seafarers' rights or that work with providing knowledge and education, those are really helpful because they try to make sure that the message does get across to the seafarers. Unfortunately, I think that the largest part of population of seafarers, they don't even have to or need to know what the just transition is. I think they simply need to be assisted in how their basic labor rights, and among those I also include, training and career development, because that's part of legal requirement under MLC, how all of those could be actually effectively implemented.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, Alina, I've got one more question. If anybody else has got a final question, please do put it in the chat now, because otherwise I'll put this question to Alina and then we'll wrap up the webinar. So, Alina, for my final question to you, this concept, again, going back to this concept of the just transition, it emphasizes that no worker should be left behind as industries evolve. Can you perhaps elaborate on what specific protections and opportunities seafarers should be advocating for as our vessels become more automated, environmentally regulated?
Yeah, I think there is quite a range of things that could be done. I do believe strongly, I mentioned this a couple of times, but I will say that on individual basis, seafarers should be mindful of their job security. I think that is an underpinning factor that is building the building block, the foundation of your ability. Then I think it's career planning, for instance, and progression. So actively seeking those opportunities. Once again, perhaps using shipboard management meetings to see if you do have vessels in the fleet that operate on alternative fuels, requesting the training opportunities, requesting to be transferred, given that information in maybe appraisals, working with your HR, working with your line manager to see how you can actively, build the your career. And it's not always obviously easy, but I think when it comes especially to matters arising with health and safety concerns, that's where I think seafarers have a very strong advantage, just because of the work that has been put in place through ISM and how much responsibility there is on DPA and the shipping company to provide seafarers that security. So those tools could be quite effective and escalated quickly. But I do think that it's also being just active, through your professional associations, being active through your unions, being part of the broader community and share your stories. That can also help a lot. And I think it's just also about, being prepared for everything. It's just taking the perhaps ownership of your skills, of your knowledge, thinking about how you can, build and on that, and how you can perhaps train, reskill, and hopefully, there will be opportunities that your company will be able to support you as well. But having that active conversation, I think all of those things can help.
Great. Look, I can see there is one more question that has come in from Penn Collins. I will put that to Alina, but I've just noticed that Jeff, you've got your hand raised. Perhaps you're having trouble using the chat function or the Q&A function. Unfortunately, we can't unmute you, so if you could try and put your question in there. If you are having trouble with the chat, I will put an email address into that chat function there. It's inquiries@nautilus.org. You can email us your question and we will put that to Alina afterwards if that's okay with you, Jeff. And I do apologize if you aren't able to use the chat function or the Q&A function. But final question now from Penn Collins. Alina, you mentioned that there isn't enough regulatory policies that pressure for a just transition for seafarers. What do you think should be done to get more awareness for seafarers' needs?
Well, I think there's once again a number of things that could be done, and I think that it's the most probably effective and the one that would work is use the voice of the powerful. So those organizations that already have voice in the industry, it's getting the message across to them. So it's partnering with those organizations together and getting the concise business case. So as I called it, advocating for the benefits of that, using a very sophisticated or using the art of communication, to make that message very substantiated, to get the buy-ins from the industry. I also think that there's quite a lot of resources that could be utilized for that. So there's a lot of work that's been done with professional associations and charities. They have already collected quite a lot of data and quite a lot of information. What are seafarers' needs? There's a recent study by ISVAN that looks specifically at the worries that seafarers have in terms of decarbonization, and the fact that they do support decarbonization and they're willing to train, but they're worried about perhaps even criminalization, how all of those responsibilities would at the end translate to their liabilities and responsibilities. So I think it's just using the voice of the most powerful and articulate stakeholders to help us to get message loud and clear. And I know that, we all get disappointed a little bit with the slow pace of social change or with slow pace of how governments work and how those policies are written. But we have also some great examples, for instance, everything that's currently happening in terms of fatigue and the work that has been done in regard to fatigue. There's been a lot of research, a lot of voice of seafarers, and it has been very strongly substantiated. So I think there is a hope and those mechanisms work. Unfortunately, not always as quick as we would like them to.
Yeah, the pace of change can be really quite slow, can't it, Alina? But when we do get more protections for seafarers, then it really, shows how democratic processes really can be. So thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you to everybody who has taken part in the webinar today and who has put your questions to Alina. Unfortunately, it is all that we have time for today, but just to let you know that you can learn without limits via the MLA website and MLA courses. I've put the web address in the chat. It's mla.ac.uk. Do check them out. They've got lots of really great courses that you can take part in. And you can also build a stronger voice with other maritime professionals by joining Nautilus International. We would love to have you. I've also put our joining details in the chat, but just to reiterate, that is nautilusint.org. So until next time, thank you very much and see you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.